I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to talk about today, but I woke up, scrolled on Twitter for a little bit, and the first thing I see is people complaining about Kaisen again. And of course, it has everything to do with the Culling games and people being disappointed or upset with it or really just not vibing with it in general. Mind you, it's been like this for quite some time now. People just do not like the Culling games, and every time I see this kind of brought up on Twitter or even other social media, there's one thing that's always consistent about it. It's perfectly fine to dislike things. No one's going to tell you otherwise. However, I would also like to see people try to explain why they dislike that certain thing. Maybe they just misinterpreted it. Maybe they don't like this character. Maybe they don't like this thing that constantly happens. So there's ways to go around it, and it would make for the conversation to be a bit more digestible. In that sense, I'm a curious person. But through all of these conversations, all of these dislikes that the Culling game is currently getting, not once have I seen people really explain why they dislike the Culling games. The general terms is that it's boring, it's horrible to read weekly, the fights are not incredible enough, and then there's not enough information or story going forward. There's also the confusion surrounding the Culling games itself, and while this does give you a starting point of an explanation, it doesn't explain why you necessarily dislike it. What's boring about this fight? What information would you want to see? What are the intricacies of your dislike? So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through the Culling games a little bit and kind of pull out some things that realistically could potentially be better but isn't the worst thing to ever exist, and try to find some sort of understanding on why people aren't really feeling this arc in general. I want to preface this and say that I've been loving the Culling games. I think it's great. I've loved all the representation for characters, all the growth, all the challenge of identities and powers. It's been a fascinating experience, and it's only just starting. This is the beginning of the Culling games. We still have so much more to go, and I imagine in due time a lot of people are going to change their tune. Starting off, the first biggest comparison that I always see is Shibuya. The reason we keep going back there, I imagine, is because it's the most popular arc that Kaisen has. It's one of the biggest turning points of the story. It's very climatic, very tension filled. It's amazing and immaculate, right? You know the funniest thing about the Culling games? What we've experienced so far is quite literally almost the entirety of Shibuya. Its length, the fights that are within it, and even the climatic tension and how it's built is identical to what we've just witnessed. So I find it funny that a lot of people relate it to Shibuya and say that Shibuya is better when a lot of Shibuya's identity is quite literally weaved directly into the Culling game's building blocks. A great way that you can kind of do this for yourself is just look at the fights in Shibuya and how they're scaled upwards. Every fight, either a showcase of power or emotion, scales higher than the previous one. This isn't anything revolutionary. This is just a normal writing technique to scale your climatic tension for massive moments or transitions within your story. The Culling games does the exact same thing. We enter it very effortlessly, and funny enough with Yuji specifically, and this isn't necessarily a showcase of power but emotional, and the difference between those things is power fights are the big domain expansions, crazy abilities flying that's kind of shocking and amazing. The emotional fights are usually character development fueled or emotionally connected. It's important to understand these because they're interchangeable. You can have emotional fights higher than the previous power and vice versa. These arcs are not identical. They offer different things and different approaches to those things, which is the most important thing. If it was identical to Shibuya, we'd obviously have a lot more issues on our hands. But the biggest or most drastic change between them is that Shibuya had 70 chapters of direction prior leading into it that made readers very aware of what was actually happening. See, Shibuya's goal is really simple. It is to seal Gojo away. That is it. And you've known that goal, or at least you've known the guidelines of that goal pretty much since the beginning of the story, that this event would take place within the story at this time and something big would happen from it. And the biggest thing that happened is obviously Gojo being sealed, which changed our whole perception of the story and completely toppled the balance of power. That's easy to understand. Culling games, however, not so much, and this is where I imagine a lot of people get a little bit confused. And while I feel the personal connection to the Culling games isn't necessarily there is a lot of pre-information that pushes you into the games. There's a lot of rules, there's a lot of specifics, but there's also a lot of outcomes. We have Kenjaku transcending, which we don't really know what that means. We have Sukuna that's already been implemented into the game. For what purpose, we're not entirely sure. We have sorcerers coming back from hundreds to 1,000 odd years ago to fight within these games to raise up cursed energy once again. We have Tengen that's very weird. We have Yuki that's very weird, and a bunch of other individual or things things that point towards the end goal. So if I were to ask you, what is the true intention, the true final goal of the Culling games, you probably couldn't give me a clear answer because there's so many of them, right? There is a perfectly explainable reason for this. We're just starting. The arc is quite literally within its first phase or act, whatever you want to call it. So even though we've kind of entered with this very basic level knowledge of where the arc should technically be going, we don't know how we're going to get there, and we don't even know the true identity of what that end goal actually is. I think this is a big issue for people. I think it makes the arc a little bit more confusing and doesn't really give you the direct focus of what the arc is actually for. See, Shibuya, you knew what was going on. You already had it right at the beginning. Gojo was sealed. The whole point of Shibuya was to try and get Gojo back as much as possible, or at least survive. In the Culling games, however, what direction do you really have other than Megami's sister, which is probably the most frequent one that constantly gets updated, yet it's almost been a year that we've been within this arc and we haven't seen her once. So I can imagine for a lot of people this is the biggest thing that they can't necessarily explain, or at least the amount of Twitter characters that you can use doesn't give you enough room to explain it. That the arc at the moment doesn't really have that overarching goal to guide you through these fights a little bit easier. But that doesn't mean that it's bad. That doesn't mean that it has no direction. It just means that there's a lot more intention put onto the weekly reading experience between these fights specifically, because each fight usually has a direction of its own and a point of evolution. When I see people say that this arc is kind of boring, I am so flabbergasted by that statement. I am genuinely shocked that people read these immaculate fights with artistry that we're getting, which is pushing these characters further and higher than we've ever seen them before, yet it's not fun, it's not entertaining, it's boring in a lot of people's eyes, and I don't understand why. This one was the biggest for me to try and understand because I couldn't tell if it was just a hatred for characters or a hatred for abilities, if it was that directionless thing that really made it difficult for people to concentrate on the fight itself because I wasn't really sure what the purpose was, yada yada. I wasn't sure. And even now I'm still a little bit all over the place about what do people truly want from a weekly shonen manga that has battling within it. Every fight that we have gotten within the Culling games has not only been a massive showcase of 1 to 2 characters' pure abilities that we've never seen before, so the peak of basically what's possible for them, it has been scaled perfectly. We started off small and then we jumped up a little bit more and then we jumped again and we got bigger and bigger and bigger, and yet we still haven't seen the pinnacle of that power. We've seen Hikari, but we haven't seen Hikari at his pinnacle, which is kind of debatable, but I imagine there's a lot more within his tank that he has yet to show off. Same with Yuta, same with Yuji, same with Megami. All these people are still learning and growing, but power-wise, you have seen a good portion of what they're capable of currently, but the key word is learning. See, these fights don't just embody power, they embody growth, they embody evolution. Every fight that you have seen within the Culling games has given you something very vitally important, an understanding for the character that they're versing, but also directly scaling the arc in response. Some characters even have a step to evolve further from it, like Maki for example. Her situation isn't a showcase of power because even though she is such an incredibly powerful individual, I don't think it would scale over Hikari's showcase. His was very, very high. Instead, we're getting something that is more personal, more emotional. We're taking her through the lengths of evolution and we're truly figuring out what freedom means to her. This is wholeheartedly valuable, something that is needed for every single character. So for us as readers, we can emotionally connect to them again, or even more than what we originally were. So if you love Maki prior, you will love her a lot more now from seeing her evolution. This is the growth that you want. We had the exact same thing for Yuta. It was fractional, but it was there. We had the showcase for Hikari. There was a lot of growth there for him as an individual. Yuji was one of the most empowering and beautiful ones we've seen right at the beginning of the arc. It introduced us, accepted a big portion of the disgusting nature that is Sukuna that's within inside of him, but he accepted it from his point of view. That's the consequences. That's all the issues that surround that power. And you can tell that it's meddled with him quite a bit emotionally and mentally. He's not the same individual that he was within Shibuya. You can see it with Megami. He's a lot more stressed, but he's also a lot more focused. He's desperate even because he's fighting to try and find his sister. And he's pushing himself to the limit to learn and evolve and to understand everything so rapidly. He's trying to think of of rules, he's trying to play the game as best as possible. You are seeing your favorite characters thrive within an environment that is so hostile. So whether they're fighting, whether they're working together or struggling to survive, you are seeing them evolve. Even if you disliked this arc and all the fights within it, you would still come out with beautiful character development that is associated with each fight. The only issue that I could genuinely think of when it comes to these fights being quote unquote boring or people just not really vibing with it is that it's the weekly experience. That reading one chapter every single week sometimes just isn't enough. That it slows down the pacing, or maybe the fight itself is a little bit too big. But see, this is the problem when it comes to long-winded fights. Instinctively, people are going to compare Maki's fight to Yuta and Hikari's, but Maki's fight isn't a showcase of power. It's powerful. What's important from it is her evolution, her growth. With Hikari's and Yuta, the primary focus is the showcase of power, with a sprinkle growth with the evolution. When you put them side by side, they're obviously not going to compare. You're going to have much more of a dopamine fill with Yuta and Hikari's fight because of that power importance. That's the point. But when you go to things like Maki or Yuji or even Megumi, for example, having these fights that are filled with more evolution and more growth makes those power fights stand out a lot more. Maki being here now is a transition. Quite literally what her character is going through. It couldn't paint it clearer for you. It's not meant to overshadow or scale higher than Yuta or Hikari. It's meant to sit even with them. This is the biggest point of evolution, and from here we start scaling once again. But we can do this differently now. It's not going to be like the first part of the Culling games because the story is about to shift. Rules are about to change. This is when we add in something that recontextualizes the entire arc and potentially provide that overarching end goal that a lot of people like, so the guidelines feel a bit more clear. Because of all of this, the weekly reading experience can be difficult. It can be difficult for a lot of stories. Now, no one's telling you that you have to love Kaisen. No one's telling you that you're wrong for disliking these characters or these things, right? But if you are someone that finds himself disliking this arc or not really vibing with it or whatever it may be and can't really explain why, maybe give yourself a break. I think the fact that you can't give yourself an explanation probably means that you're burnt out with manga in general, or at least with Kaisen in general. Admittedly, some of these fights run longer than what a lot of people would want. Reading them a handful of chapters at a time can be really refreshing and really nice, but it may be something that works better for you. There's a lot of amazing stories out there. I'm sure you'll find one that works with your taste and what you want from a manga experience within a weekly, monthly story, whatever it may be. I wish you the best of luck. Hopefully this helped just a little bit.